Hola a todos, bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Juani. Two simple ways to dramatically improve your Spanish conversations for beginners. Step number one, using compound phrases with common verbs in Spanish using the yo and the tú forms in particular. And step number two, practicing them in a conversation-like environment, which is exactly what we're going to do today. Moving forward, before we jump into some conversation practice, let's first take a closer look at these compound phrases so that you can understand them grammatically, so that you can also see how simple they are, but also how effective they are in improving your Spanish conversation. Now, let's start by looking at this common and useful verb in Spanish, the verb querer, which is to want. Let's now break this down or conjugate it in the present tense in the yo and the tú forms. So I want is yo quiero. I want. The tú form is quieres. You want. Now put simply, a compound phrase would be conjugating a verb like querer, but then adding on another verb straight after that, but grammatically, we don't have to conjugate it in this particular context. We can just leave it in its unchanged infinitive form, making it a lot easier to form phrases and sentences. Por ejemplo, quiero ir a la playa. Quiero ir a la playa. I want to go to the beach. Very simple phrase. Again, you can see here we're conjugating the verb querer by saying quiero, I want. We're then adding on the verb ir, to go, unchanged, and it's unconjugated infinitive form. Then we're just finishing off the sentence, quiero ir a la playa. I want to go to the beach. Let's try another one. Quiero estudiar esta noche. Quiero estudiar esta noche. I want to study tonight. Again, conjugating the verb querer in the yo form, I want, quiero. We're then adding on the verb estudiar, to study. Again, unchanged in its infinitive form. I think you're getting the hang of it. Let's try another one. Quiero visitar a mis amigos. Quiero visitar a mis amigos. I want to visit my friends. This time we're putting the unconjugated verb after quiero, which is visitar, to visit. So I think you're starting to get the hang of it. Let's try another one though in the tú form. ¿Quieres ir al cine conmigo? ¿Quieres ir al cine conmigo? Do you want to go to the cinema or the movies with me? Again, this time we're using the verb ir, to go, unchanged. And you can see to start with, we're conjugating the verb querer in the tú form because we want to say, do you want, which is quieres. So, quieres ir al cine conmigo. As you can see grammatically, it's pretty simple to form, isn't it? All you simply have to do is conjugate that first verb, and then that allows us to add on a second verb straight after that in its unchanged infinitive form. So it's easier to make sentences and form phrases when you're first starting to learn Spanish and you're trying to get conversational in the language. Moving forward now, these three verbs, in my opinion, are the ones you would really want to focus on when it comes to getting conversational. First up, we've got the verb querer, which we just went through, to want. We've also got the verb tener, which is to have. And then lastly, we've got the verb poder, which is to be able to, or translates to can in English. Moving on, now that we understand grammatically how these compound phrases work, it's now time to practice them in a real-life conversation-like environment so you actually get a chance to actually practice them, but also say them out loud as well, which is very important. What I'm going to do now is ask you some very basic questions in Spanish, and then the first time I ask you that question, I'm going to put a response on the screen that I want you to just say out loud so that you can practice your conversation and get an idea for how these conversations and sentences all fit together. And then I'm going to ask you that same question a second time. And the second time, I'm just going to leave the screen blank, and I just want you to come up with a response yourself. So I'll give you about 10 or so seconds to just basically say out loud whatever response you want to say, whatever comes to the top of your head. If you do need more time though, feel free to just hit pause on the video. Great, let's put it into practice now. So let's imagine that me and you are speaking directly in person right now, and I ask you, ¿Qué quieres hacer hoy? And you respond. Good start. Now I'm going to ask you that question again a second time, and I want you to respond with whatever you see fit. So I would obviously encourage you to try and use a compound phrase in this scenario. So let me ask you again. ¿Qué quieres hacer hoy? Great job. How did you do, and were you able to form a compound phrase? If not, don't worry, it does take practice, and I am going to ask you 2 more questions. Moving on to question number 2. Let me ask you, ¿Tienes ganas de ir de compras? And you respond. Good job. So that's an example of what you can say. As I mentioned before, now I'm going to ask you that same question a second time. I'm going to give you 10 seconds and you respond with whatever you want to respond with. But again, try and use a compound phrase if you can. So let me ask you again. ¿Tienes ganas de ir de compras? Good work. How did you do that time? Was it a bit easier to come up with a phrase or a compound phrase to respond with? If not, don't worry. Let's see how you go the third time around. Question number 3, let me ask you this time. ¿Quieres hacer algo esta noche? And you reply. Great job. So I'm going to ask you that question again as per normal, and you've got 10 seconds. Try and come up with a response yourself off the top of your head, again using a compound phrase. So let me ask you again. ¿Quieres hacer algo esta noche? Great job, everyone. Now the next step is to try and implement these compound phrases into a real-life conversation, ideally with a native speaker. If you got any value from this video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Hasta pronto.